Hi, this is Rachel Wilson. I'm the author of The Game of Boys and Monsters. It's a short story available on HarperTeen Impulse. And a college class in education at Towson University just read it as part of their coursework. And I'm going to try to answer some questions that they have. Anyone's welcome to view this, but I recommend you read the story first because I might accidentally spoil some things and it probably won't make a lot of sense to you without having read it first. So let's dive in. I was very gratified by your responses. Thank you for being so thoughtful about the story. There were a lot of insightful comments, and I'm not going to name names. I'm just going to address some things that came up a lot or specific questions without naming where they came from. So we're dealing with this question of ambiguity, right? This question of not knowing what's real, what's imaginary, what's intended to be a plot point, and what's intended to be symbolic or metaphorical. And to start out, I would argue that anything you read in a work of fiction is symbolic or metaphorical. We're dealing with content that's entirely made up, right? So in a sense, anything that happens, even if it's not a fantastical event, is going to mean something more than what it is on the surface. But I think what really draws me to fantastical ambiguity is that question that you're left with. I'm always drawn to literature that raises questions more than it answers them. I'm interested in reading something that leaves me thinking about the world I live in and gives me a little bit that sense of wonder and possibility, what might be around the corner. I think I know what's real, but do I really? So that's something that I was going for with this story, and I'm glad that it came through for you guys. I really appreciate that so many of you were intrigued, if sometimes maybe frustrated even, by that not knowing. And if you're turned on by that kind of ambiguity, I would really recommend reading Imaginary Girls by Nova Rensuma. That was a big influence for me in writing this story. Also, I read it after I wrote this, but I love Liar by Justine Larbalestier. It's there's a question ongoing and never resolved. Those are two that I would recommend for that kind of looking at that kind of ambiguity. So to the person who asked, does the author know what's real and what's not? I think so. Yeah, I think in order to go, to that place where you are creating the fantastic event, you have to believe in it. You have to believe in it when you're writing it. And for me, there was no question that Les is having a nightmare and that this all might be imaginary. I think Les has that question. Les isn't sure what she believes, and I want the reader to have that feeling along with her. I wanted to create a story that was so grounded in the real world that once the fantastic elements start creeping in, it's a little unnerving. If suddenly this real world that we all believe in so fully is suddenly challenged by something that doesn't seem possible. So I didn't want to start off in a world where vampires are real and werewolves are possible. Someone called this a story of two best friends that grew apart when boys came into the picture. I think that's a great short summary. This friendship between Les and Evie, why is it falling apart? Why are they growing apart? What's gotten between them? And I think it's more than boys. A lot of you noticed that Les has a weaker sense of self than Evie, that maybe she's been building her identity around Evie for a long time. And now that Evie is dwindling, Les is finally coming into her own and maybe even taking on some of Evie's traits. That's something that I see play out in real life between girls all the time, and I was really interested in capturing that uncomfortable dynamic where a friendship that's been serving its purpose and has been fulfilling to both people suddenly becomes sort of suffocating or overwhelming, oppressive even for one person. The stronger friend has become almost oppressive to the weaker friend, And in order for the weaker friend to come into her own, that friendship needs to become less central in her life. And I think there is some moral ambiguity in Les's actions. I think she could be held accountable. I'm not sure she is the best friend to Evie in this situation. And that's also something I was interested in, that uncomfortable moment when maybe a friend stops being a good friend because the friendship has become destructive for them. In terms of the boys and their monstrosity, when I was in high school, it was right around the time of the Spiderwebs song, I'm just a girl, so don't let me go out late at night. There was a lot of fear, and I think there still is, for young women, about being outside at night, being alone after dark, being alone with men that you don't know very well. And that fear causes nightmares, it causes a lot of discomfort, and maybe it helps you make smart choices sometimes, but it can also really limit you. And I think one thing I was interested in is that in our culture we have, on the one hand, this fear that many women experience. I'm going to grab my dog because he's being a dick. So on the one hand, we have this fear that women experience, fear of having harmful things done to them, having violence visited on them. And on the other hand, we have so many stories of sexy, dangerous men. There's something really compelling about the guy who could kill you, but won't, for whatever reason. And this story was to a large extent me exploring my ambivalent feelings about that. I guess I was interested in looking a little bit at what happens when that fantasy comes into play in a more grounded world, where things don't turn out in a romantic way. A few people commented on loving romantic fiction and really being into this story for the romantic element. To my mind, it's almost an anti-romantic story. I love romance as well. My debut novel that's out, Don't Touch, is very romantic in its way. But to my mind, this story is sexual, but not romantic. The Marsh brothers are dangerous and they're compelling, but they're not good guys. And eventually Les does have a romantic connection toward the end of the story, and that might be what you guys are referring to. And I think that for her, Ben is the guy who is maybe not as compelling on the surface, but maybe she'll give him a little bit more of a chance now that she's spent some time around these monsters. There was a question from one reader about the flatness of the male characters and whether that was intentional. To some extent it was intentional. Part of it is that this is a short story, so you get to know Les a lot better than you get to know anyone else. Part of it is that, for me, yes, the Marsh brothers are archetypes. They're representing this fantastical ideal of the compelling, sexy, dangerous guy. And because we don't ever know for sure what their true nature is, I didn't want to get too close to them. I don't want to fully understand them. Les can't fully understand them. Maybe Evie does, but Les doesn't. And in terms of Ben, I think for Les, she is also seeing him, she is just now seeing him as a person, as another human who she might have an actual connection with. I think for her so far, these guys have all, or early in the story, I think for Les, early in the story anyway, these guys are all people that she approaches in a somewhat shallow way. She hasn't gotten to know them very well. She's classified them into archetypes. She's she might be interested in them, but she's not really engaging with them. And I don't mean to suggest that that's a great way to treat guys. I don't think it is. But I think that Les is sort of coming into, I think Les is, as she's getting more comfortable with herself and more able to make a connection that's real, she'll get to know Ben more and more. But that's just beginning as this story is ending. Yes, I read all the Twilight books. I didn't love them, but I respect that many readers do. I was interested in how much people love Edward, even though he is very controlling, very dangerous. Physical love between Bella and Edward is physically harmful to her. It's dangerous. I guess I was curious to some extent, what would happen if Bella had a friend? If she had a female human friend who saw this relationship developing, and wouldn't her friend be worried for her? Wouldn't her friend have some questions? And beyond that, I was interested in kind of reclaiming the vampire trope, and taking it out of paranormal romance and putting it back in horror. So while I was inspired by Twilight, I would say I was almost more inspired by Dracula. I read that I reread it soon before I wrote this story. And if you're familiar with that, the two women, Mina and Lucy, are they're very different archetypes of femininity. And I thought a lot about Les as a Mina type and Evie as a Lucy type when I was writing this. And the image when Les goes to Evie's house and sees her standing in the door and she's silhouetted with the light behind her and she's all in white, that was very much influenced by like my vision of what Lucy might look like to Mina after she started to turn into a vampire. Was the speed or the pace of the ending an item you were focused or cognizant of as you were writing? Yes and no. When I first wrote this, I wrote it pretty quickly, and when I reached the ending, it surprised me. But I realized that for a short story, that was the point in the story where the questions that I had raised sort of reached their conclusion. I didn't want to know what happened to Les next. If you held a gun to my head, I would probably say that she'll be left with questions about what happened to Evie and how much of it was actually real. And I don't think, I wasn't interested in the aftermath beyond that. Great. Someone says, I personally identified with Les. In my adolescence, I felt like a social ghost and have only fairly recently arrived to who I am today. Was there any inspiration behind the characters? I love that phrase, a social ghost. I think I felt that way a lot in high school. I felt a little bit out on the outs and not super comfortable in my own skin. So yeah, I think there probably is an aspect of that. That's something I understand about Les. And Evie is certainly someone that I would have liked to be at that age. Someone says, wondering about whether Evie's relationship with her mom was meant to reflect on how a teen's home environment shapes their social environment. That came about a little bit by accident. I think as a writer, a lot of the time you write something and you don't know what you're trying to say until you set it down for a while, and then you come back to it later and you're like, oh yeah, I did mean that. So yes, I didn't set out to say that intentionally, but that was definitely something I was interested in for Evie. As strong as she is and as forceful as her personality is, I think Evie is someone who is coming from a core of insecurity. I think that her relationship with her mom kind of gives you a little bit of background into a weakness that Evie has, a sense of weakness from her childhood of not being secure in the world, not feeling secure with her parents. Advantages or drawbacks to creating a short story as opposed to a novel? They're just two different animals. It takes much longer to work on a novel, so that's a great reason to work on a short story. I actually wrote this while I was revising my novel, and it was nice to have something shorter to focus on, kind of in between getting notes back from my editor. So that's a huge benefit. I have a hard time letting go of stories, though. So for me, that was a big drawback to this. Was sort of it reached its end. It's like, oh, that's all there is. I want to explore more. So I know as a reader, I'm more drawn to novels than short stories, and that's probably what I'm more interested in writing as well. It just takes so long. Physical monsters versus incorporeal monsters. Someone asked, are they physical monsters for indulging in the physical, or is the physicality of the monsterness a product of their internal monster, possibly the same internal monster that prevents the protagonist from rising to action? So someone mentioned lesbian undertones between Les and Evie. I think it comes out of that very intense friendship, and for young women, often there's a very deep and intense love for your best friends that's sometimes stronger than any romantic connection you might have or sexual connection you might have at that age. So I think that's a lot of what is in there. Obviously, Les's name, Les, I was aware that it could sound like the word less, and also maybe like lesbian, the beginning of lesbian, and I didn't consciously pick that, but once that was her name, that was her name, and I felt all right about both of those things being under there. Someone called this a not so normal paranormal young adult story. Love it. Oh, I gotta say one more thing. So several of these responses mentioned science fiction, and I get where that comes from, because even, on Amazon Books, they put science fiction and fantasy together. But I think you have to be careful with naming genres. There's no science in this story. Any science is like the girls going to their physics class or whatever. I don't remember what class they're in, but this is definitely fantasy. You could call it paranormal, you could call it horror, or you could call it fantasy, but I wouldn't call it science fiction. Usually science fiction is based in some actual science, some fiction around scientific potential, so things that are either now possible or might become possible in the future. And then sometimes people also mix in there speculative fiction, which is imagining a future or an alternate present that is different from our own. That sometimes also can fall under the cap of fantasy, but this is not that either. Yeah, so I would call it horror, or I would call it paranormal fiction. Both of which fall under fantasy. Cool. Thank you guys for reading and for bringing so much thought to this. It was really interesting for me to look back at the story through the lens of your comments and questions. So thank you for that too. And yeah. Remy, come here. You want to sit with me? Great.